Professor Gary Barkhuizen. I just asked him the name Barkhuizen is originally German, but Barkhuizen. Barkhuizen, originally German name, and then in South Africa, and then changed Barkhuizen. So, Professor Barkhuizen is Professor of Applied Linguistics at the University of Auckland, New Zealand. So when he came this Saturday, he brought all the rain from the Pacific Ocean. Oh, no. Remember, right? We were having beautiful, sunny, and then Saturday, I thought, oh, Gary's coming, and then it's raining. Yeah, Pacific Ocean rain. So Gary's teaching and research interests are in the areas of teacher education, teacher language identity, and learner identity, study abroad, narrative inquiry, and his attitude of reflections on language teacher identity research. And he just gave me this book, which is so good because it's called Qualitative Research Topics in Language Teacher Education. So those of you who are looking for a research topic, this is very useful. So this morning we already had a workshop in our FCL doctoral class with Gary, with some of the doctoral students here, and now we have a public seminar, and we already have sparked a lot of interest in talking about how we use stories and how we analyze stories. So without further ado, let's put our hands together. Oh, that's right.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a channel, research channel that my research students and I are setting up. Okay, so the reason why I am doing this, yeah, you can give them the QR code so that you can, because I'm going to, tomorrow, one of my PhD students and one of my postdocs will be interviewing Professor Gary Barkhuizen, and we will put it up on the channel. So I'm doing this channel mainly to create a space to link up research students, master students, postdocs, and established scholars, researchers. It's kind of like an interactive space. Because last year, whenever I invited scholars from overseas, it's an uphill battle to get my students into the Sun University. It's very busy. So, and I just feel that we want to get more in-depth interactions with the invited scholars. And we will have a methodology series. This is just the first, that is narrative analysis. So please take this QR code. We will have further interviews of experienced scholars talking about research methodology and also current topics in our field, in applied linguistics, in language education. So please support us and send this link to the QR code. We need more subscribers. Yeah. Anyway, so please tune into the research channel.
Just in case okay, if you want to see the bigger screen, you've got another option here, okay?
Okay, for those who just come in, you can scan the QR code. We are going to have an interview with Professor Gary Barkhuizen on narrative inquiry, and we're going to put it up on our channel. And this is also live stream on Friday. Okay, so wow, there's lots of action going on. Yeah. I have been so conservative when I was asked how big do you want to book a room, I said 25, because I don't think more than 25 people. It's not because of the speakers, because Vancouver people are very busy. Okay, so. Okay, so this YouTube channel, whenever we have international scholars, I will have interviews of the scholars and put it up in the channel, and my research students will be the host. They will be the ones who come up with interview questions, and coming from the perspectives of researchers and emergent scholars. So we can show the QR code again, and they can scan the QR code with your phone, and then we will have more to come. Okay, without further ado, thank you very much. Let's put our hands together again.
Great, thank you very much. Thanks for the welcome. Angel, it's lovely to be here. I'm really pleased to be here. And sorry about the rain I brought over the weekend, but it's the sun today, so that's nice. Lovely, lovely day. I'm just interested, before I get going, how many people decided to come today because of an interest in narrative, and how many decided to come because of an interest in study abroad? So with narrative, put the hands up, more to the narrative side. Okay, that's everyone. Okay, so I'll be talking about a study abroad project, a big project, and then focusing more specifically on one study abroad student that I continued working with that came out of that big project, and all of it is narrative. So what I hope to do is to demonstrate different types of narrative data collection and different types of narrative analysis, both as part of a research team and also individually, and short-term and longitudinal as well. So I thought I'd just put everything out there, and then I can go through it quite quickly. We've got a bit of data that we can look at together, and then leave some time for some questions and some discussion. But please, if you have a question while I'm talking, put up your hand and we can have interaction all the way through. I did a similar presentation for the first half of what I've got planned today at another workshop in Indonesia with a group of graduate students. And at the end of it, they all said they'll never do narrative inquiry because you need to do it for 3 years. Because the first part of the study was a 3-year project. And so they all thought, and I should have clarified it right at the beginning, that this was an international research team that worked on the first part of the project. And they thought that I was illustrating how you should do narrative inquiry, and they thought that was the formula for how to do it. So I had to try and undo a lot of what I had been saying. So let me say right up front that I'm showing lots of different types of narrative data collection and narrative analysis, just to show you the various bits and pieces that make it up. I'm not going to give an overview of what narrative inquiry is or what narrative analysis is. I'd rather sort of illustrate it through the study that unfolded over some time. I do just want to give a little bit of some theoretical background, just a tiny bit. And those who were at the workshop this morning, the class this morning, will have seen 1 or 2 of these slides. So please forgive me for those. It's only just 1 or 2. And this is one of them. And it's a really nice quote from Crap about what stories are. And I use it to make the point about why I think stories are firstly central to narrative research, and also why stories are central to narrative research. I really like this, it's one of my favorites. It says, stories assist humans to make life experiences meaningful. So just as you read it, or as you listen to me read it, just think about the meaning there. Stories assist humans to make life experiences meaningful. It sets up a connection between stories and the meaning we make through the telling and the sharing and the listening to stories. Stories preserve our memories through the story. And that's so true, right? I mean, my partner, for example, tells stories endlessly, all the time. He talks through stories. Stories. And it's all the memories. Those are the memories that make up his life experiences. These stories, these endless stories. They make life experiences meaningful. They prompt our reflections. Through the telling of stories, we need to reflect on our life experiences. In order to tell the story, to put the story together, we need to reflect on those life experiences. And when we tell stories to different people, we tell them in slightly different ways because we reflect on our stories in different ways, right? So stories prompt our reflections and they connect us with our past and our present. The stories have a temporal dimension. The stories, they relate to our memories, but they also help us to envision our future. We imagine stories of ourselves, of our experiences in the future. And if this is the case, if you believe this, then you can see why stories make sense in a research environment. Stories would be really useful for research purposes because we want to learn about the experiences of our research participants and we want to learn how they make meaning of those experiences and how they share those meanings with us and how we co-construct those meanings with them in the co-construction of their data. So this is a really meaningful quotation. Okay, and so today, eventually, I'm going to be telling the story about Max. Max is a study abroad student who was from Hong Kong and who went to the University of Auckland in New Zealand, where I work. And he came to do his BA degree there. And after he finished that, I'll give you much more detail about him later, but after he finished his BA, he went back to Hong Kong and he did a postgraduate qualification in communications. And since he went back, we've maintained contact over the years. And he still lives and works now in Hong Kong. And I met up with him quite recently again. So I'm going to be telling you about Max, but I want to give you the background on where he came from and how we got connected. Okay? And it started with this study that I was involved in with Phil Benson, Peter Bodycott, and Joel Brown. This was a Hong Kong Research Grants Council funded study, which Phil Benson was the principal investigator for. Called Study Abroad in Second Language Identities, a Hong Kong-based study. And eventually it resulted in a report of the study in the form of that book over there. And I'll tell you a little bit about what that looks like later. So it was a 3-year research project, which was interesting because it was a big project. It had substantial funding. There were 4 of us, and over the course of the project, we were living on different continents, right? So some were in Hong Kong, some in Australia, and I was in New Zealand. So we had to do the project through Skype and through other means. So it was an interesting way of doing research. It was the first time I'd actually experienced that. But it was very much a narrative study. And as you can see from the title of the book report, Second Language Identity in Narratives of Study Abroad. So that's where it all started. And the aim of the study was to investigate the development of Hong Kong students' second language identities through individual case studies of their study abroad experiences. So quite a broad aim. We called their identities second language identities, although I prefer to call it something else, but at the time we referred to their second language identities in study abroad contexts. And we wanted to see how Hong Kong students who went to study abroad in different countries, from a range of different countries, how it changed their identities in some way through having to use or learn a second language. It wasn't always English, it was mainly English, but there were some students who went to Norway, some went to Germany, and so on. But mainly it was English. And we were interested in how the study abroad experience affected their identity. So we looked at identity change as a result of being in a study abroad context. That was the overall aim. Just a little bit here. With study abroad, it's typically an experience in which embodied identities are relocated. By embodied identities, we mean the identity that's in this body. So, in Gary. So when I move to a different place or as I move around, the identity that's associated with me, this embodied identity, when those are relocated and the reflexive imagined identities are challenged, reflexive identity refers to the how we see ourselves. So it's looking at how I see myself, my reflexive, looking inwards, how I see my own identity. And imagined identity is how I imagine myself in a different place or in a different time, and potentially a future time. So with imagined identities, before you go on study abroad, you imagine yourself in the study abroad context, but also you imagine yourself post-sojourn, so after the study abroad when you return to Hong Kong in this case. So you imagine how you will be when you return, okay? So identities are challenged by the need to achieve recognition for identities in an unfamiliar cultural setting. This challenge to identify may be characteristic of all study abroad experiences, but when study abroad involves a second language, it is heightened by the need to do identity work in the second language or the additional language, which poses particular challenges to students' second language identities. So when you're doing study abroad, so for example, I studied abroad in the US. That was a cultural challenge for me to my identity. But I was in an English-speaking environment, although New York English, there's some challenges there, of course. But when you speak in an entirely different language, in a very multilingual setting, for example, then there are certain challenges that you face in that study abroad context. Okay, so we were interested in some of these challenges and some of the changes to the participants' identities. And very broadly, we said second language identity relates to any aspect of a person's identity that is connected to their knowledge or use of a second language. And that is how we defined it very broadly at the time. More recently, I referred to identity as multilingual identity, acknowledging that the notion of language as a separate and autonomous entity is a myth. So I prefer now in my recent work, I'm looking at study abroad, I refer to multilingual identity rather than second language. But at the time of the study, we referred to it as second language identity. Okay, so just a bit about the study then. So I want to start now by just talking you through some of the methods we used and to show how they were narrative, and the sense that they were narrative. Okay, so there were 48 case studies, 48 participants who went from Hong Kong to other places, right? And you can see a list there. There were secondary school students, first year undergraduates. The majority of them were second year English majors who did a credit bearing overseas immersion semester. So they had to go overseas for a semester as part of their study. That was the majority of them. But there were others who organized their independent study abroad. And Max was number 5, undergraduate degree in an overseas university. So we'll get on to Max later. But he independently went to a university in New Zealand to do his undergraduate degree. Okay, and there were postgraduate degrees. There were 48 participants from a range of different contexts. Okay, so that's the list of participants. So, fairly typical of study abroad, we did a pre-departure interview. Okay, and this was done mainly by research assistants based in Hong Kong, and the interviews were done mainly in Cantonese. So the research assistant based at the Hong Kong Institute of Education, where I was based for a while on sabbatical, but the interviews were done mainly by the research assistants. There were more than one. With Max, when he came to New Zealand, I did the interview with him in English. So there were variations. Some of the other researchers did interviews in Hong Kong in English, so there was variation. But there was a pre-departure interview, and the interviews were quite narrative in their form. So we asked the participants to tell us about their language learning careers. You know, what languages do you speak, where did you learn them, when did you learn them? So there was some sort of temporal dimension. I started learning English in grade this, and then I went to this school and I did some more English. And so they gave their language learning histories. they also spoke about their expectations of study abroad, what they expected would happen to themselves, and how they saw themselves, that last point, as language learners and language users, depending on what country they were going to, English learners, English users, how they would see themselves on the study abroad experience. And we had a set of topics that we wanted to cover, not necessarily questions. We were more interested in covering a range of topics in that pre-departure interview. So that was what we did at the beginning, right? So to get some background information. Then while they were abroad, we asked them to provide some online, ongoing commentary of their experiences. And this was managed by the project research assistants. So for example, maintaining blogs, email contact, chat sessions, photographs, writing about photographs, and so on. So how well do you think this worked?
Semi-well, okay.
Yeah, they were too busy having fun, right? They were having good fun. So much fun, they didn't really do this so well. So the data we got for this was very average. Okay. Now, some may say, well, why didn't you require it of them? Well, we couldn't do that because they weren't, as you can see, there were 48 participants from all over. It wasn't a course they were doing. If it was a course, we could have made it an assignment or a course requirement or something. And people do that. You know, if they go on an immersion program or an internship, there can be certain requirements they have to meet in order to get the credit and so on. But we couldn't do that because these were volunteers on our research and so on. There were some interesting bits of data, some nice photos, bits of not great. So any advice I would give when you're doing some sort of project like this is to try to build in some requirement if it's related to a course, or to provide very specific guidelines for volunteers and to keep that contact, very close contact with them while they're away, if it's possible. And then when they came back, post-study interviews reflected the pre-departure interviews. So again, the language was mainly Cantonese and conducted by the research assistants in Hong Kong. And the topics reflected the pre-departure interviews again. So asking about their language and their personal experiences while they were abroad. And we had, because the interviews were done by different people, not only the assistant, we had a set of topics that we agreed to. And we covered those, we made sure that we covered all of those topics, not necessarily in the same order, because narrative interviews tend to go all over the place, but we tried to cover those topics. And again, to build into the discussion, into the interview, the learner's perceptions of themselves as a language learner and a language user. And we wanted to, we were quite interested to see if there was a change in, I'm going to study abroad to see if I can learn more English, or while I was there, I found I was using more English rather than just being a learner. And we wanted to see if there was a point where they changed that identity. Okay. So, method, the second phase was, right. So for each of the 48 participants, we had a pre-interview, we had a little bit of stuff from while they were away, and then a post-departure interview. So we had a set of data for all 48 participants. A complete data set were compiled for each of the 48, and 11 or 12 cases were assigned to each of the 4 researchers. Okay. Then the next thing we wanted to do was to take each case and to write. We each wrote a 2,000-word narrative of experience that constructed broadly about the experience and the issues of identity development, particularly focusing on the topic, the second language identity changes as language learner, language user. So this is another part of narrative inquiry now, not only collecting stories, but constructing stories. as your findings. So constructing stories as your findings. And this was one of the things that we attempted to do. So we decided we were going to write a 2,000-word narrative for each of the 48 participants. Now, it's not just summarizing the data, right? But it's rather writing a narrative that relates to your research topic. All right? That's very important. So you've got to think, we're focusing on second language or multilingual identity development, and we need to write a narrative on their second language identity development while they're on study abroad. Okay. Right. So as an experiment, what we did, I was saying this morning in class, as an experiment what we did was we said, let's try and write, we take one case, there are 4 of us. Let's try and write one for one person without giving any guidelines and see what we all come up with, just as an experiment. And we went away and then we each wrote a 2,000-word narrative, and then we shared it and we got online on Skype to have a look at our 4 different narratives. And they were so completely different. They were so different. For example, mine was quite an academic narrative. So I was almost feeling I needed to reference the literature, right? And I was writing in a sort of academic style. I tried not to, wanted to put quotes in, or I better not, and so it was quite formal. One person wrote a really good one, which became more or less the standard, where was sort of basically saying what had happened, inserting quotes from the interviews, making it very readable, focusing on identity, fine. One person, obviously with a strong literary background, wrote this very sort of airy-fairy, making up a lot of descriptive adjectives about the way things were and the way the person felt that was like nowhere in the interviews at all. So it was quite different, and we had to decide on how we were going to try and standardize them for the purposes of the study. It took a lot of discussion, but we eventually did this. I just thought I'd show you, if I can just bring it up quickly. Just as an example of, make it a bit bigger. Yeah, I won't read the whole thing, but this is one for Max. Learning English began early for Max. Formal instruction started in preschool from the age of 2. He also attended classes organized by the British Council from the age of 6. He took these classes for 10 years and enjoyed the communicative games and activities provided in a less structured approach. What started as support to ensure he had, and now we're inserting a quote from his interview, the chance to learn and practice the language in an outside the classroom environment, the influence of development. His mother believed that following the textbook or doing exact practices are not the ideal way of learning English, and was keen for him to have the chance to interact with native English speakers. Max's developing interests and skills were supported by frequent trips to visit his aunt in Canada, and so on and so on and so on. Max's British Council travel experience is faster. So you see the idea, we're writing a narrative based on the data from the interviews. From an early age, he was proud of being able to speak English. He contrasts his English skills with those of his friends. And then a slightly longer quote here. When some of my friends don't speak English as well as I do, for example, there's a tourist asking the way, and I was the one able to answer the questions, but not some of my friends. Those occasions, I feel good. To him, many Hong Kong students, because of the schooling, write better than they speak. Max, however, believes in the importance of English. So his early background. And as we go through, Max's choice of undergrad study undergrad study location was deliberate. It was a country he had visited. This is New Zealand, right? In the past, on 3 separate occasions, it was predominantly English speaking, provided the opportunity to have a change in life. Again, a quote inserted into the narrative. The first few weeks in New Zealand were rough and tough, not because of language difficulties, but because of the basic stuff, like opening a bank account, getting a phone number, enrolling in uni courses, among other things. His expected homesickness came and was dealt with largely by brief phone calls home to family and friends, and so on. Brief trips home at the end of his first semester and at the end of his first year provided first-hand evidence to family, friends, and himself of his increasing maturity, his enhanced level of independence, and so on. These feelings of cultural identification were reinforced throughout his first year when he spoke Chinese, heard news from home, when he began to work as a DJ on a local Auckland Chinese radio station, and when he was asked to speak formally or interact socially with other students. Looking back after 1 year, you see narrative as the sort of chronological moving through the story. He sees English, he's used to it, and so on. Another longer quote here. Max continues to focus his energy on preparing thoroughly and has found that his level of interest, and so on. A number of experiences have enhanced Max's confidence in his English language skills. The first was an international night in which he was MC for the evening. Well, not his first time to host an event in English, so he has a very interesting critical incident in his first year where he hosted an international night. And what happened was he had some jokes lined up, which are basically translated from Chinese. So he called them Hong Kong jokes. And he translated them from Chinese, and he would tell the jokes, no one would get them right. Because he realized that, you know, jokes are cultural, not only language. So when he started telling English jokes, then the people would start laughing. So he learned some sort of socio-pragmatics here. Okay, so part of his identity development. He said, I don't know how to describe it, it's just a different sense of humor. I would say a Hong Kong style joke, but I translate them in English, I can see the response is less. And so on. And so we wrote, that's like a 2,000 word narrative. We did it for all 48 participants. We had 48 of these, a brilliant data source of the study abroad experiences. So once we had the 48 2,000 words written, in fact, as we had them done, we returned them to the student for correction, revision, and comment. So in case we got some facts wrong, or maybe there was something they didn't want us to have in the stories, and they would ask us to take it out. And sometimes they would comment further and add something or want something removed, and so on. And we would then make changes according to the feedback we got from the students. Just by the way, all these documents were stored on a sort of Google Docs type. It wasn't Google Docs at the time, it was something else. Okay, I've shown you that narrative. This is an interesting dimension with narrative inquiry that I've just recently written a handbook entry for core dimensions of narrative inquiry, and there are 5 dimensions which I think are the sort of fundamentals, so to speak, of narrative inquiry in applied linguistics. And this is one of them, and it always helps me feel sort of, you know, grounded when I start getting lost in narrative inquiry. And this dimension makes a distinction, not a distinction, it's a longer continuum. But on the one end of the continuum, we have analysis of narratives, or where you do a thematic analysis or a content analysis, very much like in qualitative research. So the conventional thematic or content analysis involves searching or coding the data for themes, and then categorizing the themes and looking for patterns amongst the categories, and so on. And on that side of the continuum, this is configuring the data content into a coherent story. So writing that 2,000 word narrative is towards that side of the continuum. Okay? And the outcome of the analysis is a story. So writing that story is actually analysis. It's not just summarizing the data. It's actual analysis, and it's very difficult to do. I mean, you can read, if you saw that story, you can see how it relates to the research question. It's not just made up story, it's very difficult to do. So, you know, the researcher turns the data into a story, all right? In order to get to that, we did have to do some sort of thematic analysis of the interview data, for example, to know what to put into the 2,000 word story. So we worked back and forth along this continuum. In fact, later we then did a further thematic analysis of the stories, which I'll show you next. So themes became evident through our working through this data, looking at the interviews to get the stories, and then to write the stories, and then looking at the stories as well. And through doing that and relating to the literature, looking at the theory, we developed a model of second language identities in study abroad context. It's not a model of second language identity, it's a model of second language identities in study abroad context, right? And it looks something like this. And not important what it looks like, it's just to show what we came up with. And it's, again, another continuum here, where there are three aspects of identity. And towards this end here, these are identity-related L2 proficiency. So how the L2 proficiency relates to your identity in study abroad context. So are you able to do identity work through using the second language? So it relates to socio-pragmatic skills, really. Are you able to use the additional language in the study abroad context in order to do things? In other words, in order to do your identity, to be who you want to be with other people, right? I mean, when I'm in Japan, for example, and I go into a 7-Eleven, and I can't speak Japanese at all, but I go into a 7-Eleven, I mean, I can be a tourist really well, because that's an obvious identity for me, but I can't do anything through Japanese, through using Japanese. I'm very, I'm limited in terms of what identity I can do, I can perform, right? So then L2 proficiency, socio-pragmatic related identity. Linguistic self-concept is how you see yourself through, how you see yourself, your own conception of your identity through your linguistic practices, through your language practices. So the language learner, language user, the simple, simplistic distinction that we make. And then over here, this is how, in study abroad context, how identity relates to personal development, but as mediated through the L2. So with study abroad, a lot of personal development happens. You know, with younger kids who go and study abroad, there's a lot of, you gain independence, you get away from parents, you learn this personal growth and so on. That happens anyway. But our interest was how that is mediated through the language that you're learning in the study abroad context. And okay, and that's what we're going to be focusing on the max when we get on to max. So just the final bit of the big study was we chose for reporting for the reporting part of the study in the book, we chose 10 cases. We're selected for even a closer analysis, and we came up with 5 major categories. These 3 here relate to the 3 components of the model: socio-pragmatic competence, linguistic self-competence, self-concept rather, and personal development. And then we have the other 2 where we looked at the programs, the different programs that the participants were on. So the different programs, different types, different durations, longer versus shorter, with undergrad, high school, and so on. And then we looked at different people on the same program, looking at sort of individual differences, different people on the same program. And we did a chapter for each one of those. And for each of the chapters, we selected 2 narratives, 2 of those 2,000-word narratives. Okay? So each of these chapters started with a 2,000-word narrative, and then we did a thematic analysis of those 2 chapters to discuss each of these categories. So for linguistic self-concept, for example, we presented 2 2,000-word narratives, and then through a thematic analysis, we came up with these 5 themes. We looked at language affiliation, beliefs about second language learning, emotions, others' perceptions of self, and self-concept as language learner and user. So we chose, out of the two narratives that we selected, we tried to see what the main themes were that came out of those two narratives, and then discuss those in relation to the literature, the study abroad literature, second language acquisition literature, higher education literature, and so on. So,
do you have these categories already, or you developed from reading the case?
These ones came out of a thematic analysis of the two narratives we included in the chapter. But there was a certain amount of deductive coding, because these we know from the literature are important. And what we also did was, it says constantly relating each of these to second language identity development. We knew what the study was about, we knew the literature, and we also knew the data. So sometimes we went back to the data and included some of the original data in the discussion. Okay? So, and we say that in the book. I mean, you know, you can't ignore it if it's there in the data. So it's a constant back and forth between the construction, the co-construction of the data in the interview, to the transcripts, to the writing as analysis, to the analysis of the narratives, the written narratives,